gruesome years on the front lines of World War I, United States troops are set to return home and process what they've went through. However, most if not all would return to a new battle, one within themselves and one with their home. Soldiers returning home from their tour in Europe would be met with a whole new set of challenges. A large percentage of troops returned with debilitating physical and psychological wounds, would desperately struggle to find employment and basic health care, as well as a lack of understanding and appreciation for what these men went through in their fight. When asked to describe his experience on the front lines, one veteran exclaimed, "Young men were getting slaughtered as fast as the sheep could go up the plank." These obstacles would compound the veterans' feelings of abandonment and isolation, and eventually, anger. This would be the prelude to the story I'm talking about today. The story about the BEF, or the Bonus Expeditionary Force, an organization of World War I veterans who felt so left behind by their own government after their service that they decided to march straight down to DC and go tell them how they really feel about it. As you'll see later, unfortunately they were met with a pretty brutal crackdown. However, in order to get in that, I need to explain why this situation turned out so violent and why it ended with tanks rolling through DC and the Capitol. With neon lights and prohibition still in full swing, the party life of the Roaring Twenties rages into its 9th year. Hopefulness filled the air as the newly elected Herbert Hoover took office. Yet under all the glitz and glam of the 20s, a broiling undercurrent would soon find its way to the surface after a catastrophic event, thus bringing the party to a sudden end. Just 7 months later, the great stock market crash of 1929 would happen, igniting the Great Depression, affecting all greatly, but one class had already been going through a depression 10 years prior: World War I veterans. Now fully crushed under the weight of a collapsed economy, in 1931, veterans began forming groups and heading to DC to express their discontent, thus forming what we now know as the BEF, or the Bonus Army.
The crisis spreads. From all over the country, unemployed veterans of World War I march on Washington, 15,000 of them. They demand immediate payment of a cash bonus promised them for the future. They need it now.
So by spring of 1932, veterans began descending down on DC via railcar, hitchhiking, or just straight up walking. So many, in fact, that 3 major, call them camps, really they were like shanty towns or Hoovervilles, were set up all across DC, where they began writing demands on what they wanted and what they needed from the government. But overall, their overarching goal was just to make the government's life and job as uncomfortably as humanly possible. So the debate began on what to do next. A ping-pong between the Congress and Senate and the President on how to handle the situation and what to do with them. If this is starting to sound familiar, then buckle up, because it's about to sound a whole lot more familiar the farther we go on. June of 1932, the Senate would begin the debate over how to handle the now swelling crowd of veterans flooding DC. After deliberation over 2 sessions, the Senate adjourned. The relief bill was shot down with a landslide vote. 12 in favor of the bill, 68 were not. Refusing to give up, the BEF stayed there for 1 more month, in a desperate attempt to hopefully have their demands met, or at least go home with something, rather than just absolutely nothing and wasting their time. However, on July 16th, all their fears had come true. An eviction notice was handed out to all the BEF leaders, so they were given 1 week's notice to prepare to be evicted, and after that, they had to be gone. Now, newly elected President Hoover, well, in his 2nd year I should say, was now tasked with removing over 11,500 people of men, women, and children of these veterans away from the Capitol and out of the greater DC area. July 28th, the week is up and the eviction process begins. First starting off relatively peaceful, quickly turned violent, and then into full chaos. Overwhelmed, Capitol Police halted, and Hoover called in the U.S. Army for assistance. The Army arrived under command of none other than Douglas MacArthur, who vowed to, and I quote, break the backs of the BEF, which was not an empty threat. An unknown number of U.S. servicemen backed with tanks surged the crowds and camps and met them with extreme violence. Many were beaten, arrested, gassed, and unfortunately, 2 were killed. They marched and rolled tanks through the Capitol and the greater DC area, rounding up veterans or beating them into a full rout, razing each camp they came across to the ground. No one was spared and nothing survived.
That the fight was over and all was once more quiet along the Potomac.
After the fires died down and the dust settled, rightfully so, People were pretty shocked and horrified to see what had happened. I mean, they just watched the US Army, with the go-ahead from the president, to just steamroll these people with tanks and rifles and bayonets, to just tell them to kick rocks and get the fuck out of town. It became very clear that nothing was gained from this. I mean, the veterans received no additional support, their demands weren't met, they pretty much just wasted just shy of 4 or 5 months of their life, really about a year if you consider the travel time there and back. They got nothing. They left home with the hopes that maybe they would get something, a pension, compensation, even a one-time payout, which there was deliberation back and forth on whether they should do that, and it always came down to a resounding no.
Commander W.W. Waters decided on the Johnstown camp, but he explained. At Johnstown, the 9,000 bonus seekers immediately threw up tents and shacks for themselves and families. The food problem is acute.
But you might be thinking, well, what about the government? Did they at least get anything? Did they at least save some money? Did they do anything productive or positive out of this, as if that's even possible? No, they didn't gain anything. Herbert Hoover wasn't reelected. Part of that's because of how he handled the Depression. And just to clarify things, this is not the first time something like this had happened under Hoover. I mean, there's multiple instances of not so much the army, but the police or kind of jackboot thugs being hired by the government, by proxy, to go into these Hoovervilles and just smash them up and kick people out. But they didn't gain anything. He wasn't reelected. 14 other constituents that were involved in this failed to get reelected too. So the veterans lost. The people involved in making the veterans lose lost. Nobody won. It was just a total loss, and 2 people died for nothing. Really, the only one who stands to have gained anything, you guessed it, MacArthur. This egomaniac, who, by the way, used to speak in the third person if you didn't know that, he always referred to himself as MacArthur, he would go on to not only be praised for how he handled the situation, but would later receive promotions. And I'm sure you know, if you don't, he would go on to lead the whole entire Pacific Theater in World War II. Now, could you say this event was the reason why he found himself in that position just a few years later? I can't say for certain, but I can assume it certainly helped him. So, the moral of the story is, it's like that old saying, if somebody ever tells you the government wouldn't do that, just know they would. And they will. And they have. So thank you guys for watching. I appreciate your time. And as always, you don't have to like and subscribe. I'm not going to ask you for that. That's your decision to make. The only thing I ask is, please leave a comment to tell me how I can make this better or how I can improve things, and any suggestions on what you might want to hear or stories researched. Thank you for watching. I appreciate your time, and have a good day.